We are now in part 5 of our introduction to high leverage practices, explicit instruction, and writing conditions for IEP goals. All right, so let's continue about talking about the characteristics of explicit instruction. Explicit instruction is relentless. So what does that mean? That means you as a teacher are teaching to mastery. Sometimes students need repeated practice and review. We're going to give them that. If that's what they need, we're giving it to them. Learning doesn't happen after just one lesson. If you need multiple opportunities to practice, I'm giving it to you. If you need me to do review, I'm going to give it to you. If I need to go back and reteach it, we're going to do that. If I need to provide you with scaffolding and fade that, that's what we're doing because we are teaching to mastery. We're going to continue until that student is proficient at that skill because that practice and that review are required for long-term learning, for that retention. Remember, we're shooting for maintenance, we're shooting for generalization. So again, teaching to mastery. Not only that, explicit in instruction is relentless because effective teachers adjust their instruction. If something's not working, we're going to try a new strategy. If these supports are not effective, I'm going to adapt, I'm going to add, I'm going to change those supports. We're going to increase opportunities to respond, and we will talk about this more in depth. Opportunities to respond is exactly what that sounds like. We call those OTRs. That is when students have multiple opportunities to respond, lots and lots of opportunities to respond when their learning increases. We're going to make sure that we are continuing our teaching and instructing students until they succeed. That is our goal. Not only that, explicit instruction is relentless because we use what is called distributed practice. Remember, Anita Archer talked about that in one of our videos. Because the more practice we give our students, it improves their learning. So we want them to be able to practice a skill across multiple lessons, across time. You keep hearing that. We're going to make sure they practice across time. We're going to collect data across time. Remember, we're going to make sure they show progress across time. So we're going to make sure that they have that practice. They're going to practice in different settings with different activities with different people because we want that generalization and those opportunities to practice. Because that distributed practice improves retention, it improves fluency, and it improves mastery. Not only that, in relentless instruction increases opportunities for student learns. Again, it improves that mastery. It supports our students who are struggling. It prevents students from being left behind. Effective teachers change their instruction, and we don't blame the students, and we don't give up on them. We don't blame the students. That mirror is always turned towards ourselves when students are not learning. It always comes back and we look at our instruction. Remember, we don't blame the students. We improve our instruction. So again, explicit instruction is relentless because we're going to provide repeated practice and we're going to review until students reach mastery. We are never, ever, ever giving up on students. What we're going to do is we're going to adjust our instruction or try new strategies until our students succeed. We're going to give them really lots and lots of opportunities to respond. But because remember, when students have opportunities to respond, they are actively engaged. We're going to use that distributed practice across time. We're going to give them lots of practice, lots of support, and we're not going to give up because we're going to say, what else can I do? And we're going to adjust our instruction and supports rather than blaming our students. Look at that. I see a star up in the corner. All right, let's talk about the next part of a characteristic of explicit instruction. It is engaging. We want active engagement because, again, we want active engagement because it increases acquisition of skills, retention of skills, generalization of skills. And we want our students to be actively engaged from the beginning of the lesson. That's why our review is interactive until the end. We're not going to stop. We want them actively engaged the whole time. And we want them engaged in all parts of the lesson. So remember, remember, the more engaged our students are, the more they're learning. And so here are some things that we want to look at that are key practices for active engagement. So we want to make sure that we have active student responding. We're given multiple opportunities to respond. We have choral responding or students responding in unisons. You're going to use response cards. We're going to do things like think, pair, share. You can do like thumbs up, thumbs down. All of these are just key practices, and there are many, many, many others. I just want to give you a couple of examples. So why does active engagement matter? Because remember, if students are engaged, if they are participating, then they are learning and they are retaining whatever you are teaching. Not only that, when students are actively engaged, you have less off-task behavior. You have less behavioral issues. You maximize your instructional time. That's why Anita Archer talked about a perky pace. You want to keep that brisk pace going because if you keep going, you're keeping your students engaged. Not only that, you want to really teach your routines and your procedures because you want your students and the teacher to clearly know what are my roles in this lesson. Um, when we're looking at explicit instruction being engaging, you also want to give feedback. And so there are different types of feedback you want to give. You want to give feedback on correct responses, and you want that feedback to be immediate. Because remember, when we are reinforcing our students for correct responses or correctly engaging in a behavior, when we immediately and positively reinforce those behaviors, we're increasing the likelihood that they will reoccur in the future. And so you want to give really specific feedback. We don't want to say, you know, high five, good job. You want to say, you found red, high five. That is very specific. And I know that you're learning about this in your ABA class. And for correct responses, we want to give positive reinforcement. We don't want to always think that positive reinforcement is praise. Some students are not reinforced by praise. Some students might like a high five. Some students might like a thumbs up. Some students might require, if you're doing like a token economy, it might be a token. But again, for correct responses, immediate feedback, specific feedback, and we want to positively reinforce those correct responses. And again, here was the example I just gave. We don't want to say high five, good job. We want to be very specific and say, you found red. Way to go. That is red. But you always also want to give feedback in the form of what's known as error correction. So if a student gives an incorrect response, you want to provide immediately feedback for that as well. But we want to make sure that we really focus on the correct response instead of saying, no, that's wrong. That's blue. That's not red. That's blue. Well, right now, I just really focused a lot on blue, and the answer was red. You want to be very focused and specific on that error correction. So if the student had gotten it wrong and I said touch red and they touch blue, I'm not even going to say what they got wrong. In this case, I'm going to come back and say, this is red, touch red. That's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to focus on the correct response. We will do a model lead test, or an I do, we do, you do on error correction. And so when you're doing error correction, one of the things that you could do is you could do that you model it, then you and the student do it together, and then the student practice that response, and then you reinforce it. So that's one way you could do it as well. So remember that explicit instruction is engaging because students are actively involved from the beginning to the end of the lesson. They are actively involved in all parts of the lesson. And that we know that improves their acquisition of skills, their retention of skills, and generalization. You want to be really clear about this is what the teacher is going to do, and this is what the student is going to do. We're going to have really high active engagement with lots of opportunities to respond because we don't want to have behavioral issues. We don't want students off task. We're going to keep it a really brisk, perky pace because that helps our students stay engaged, and we're going to provide provide immediately feedback that supports their learning. We're going to do that by providing immediate reinforcement and specific reinforcement for students' correct responses. And then we're also going to provide error correction in which we're focusing on that correct response. All right, here we go again. Here is our next one, is that explicit instruction is successful because it has decades and decades of research that have shown that have demonstrated it results in positive student outcomes. And here are just some examples related to explicit instruction and it having a really strong academic and behavioral outcomes. So we have, again, I'll just let you look over those to see what those examples of research sources are, but there are many, many others in addition to this. So when we think about explicit instruction being relentless, we think about it being engaging, we think about it being successful. I actually think this is number 7, not number 8. I want you to think about a class you remember learning a lot from. This class I really learned a lot in. What did the teacher do to make the instruction relentless, engaging, or successful? So give at least one specific example from that class experience, okay? So go ahead and stop your video and then come on back. All right, so again, I think that was number 7, not number 8. Doing that self-evaluation, how are you feeling now about explicit instruction being systematic, being relentless, being engaging, and being successful? If you have any questions, make sure you add them to our document, and I'll see you in our final video.